Okay, we have people coming into our broadcast, so we're going to wait a minute or so because the participant number is going up. Give it a minute, and then we'll launch our discussion. Okay. I'll dispense with a few of the details so that we can get right to the meat of the topic. Welcome to our first online Crush event in the board meeting theme. We're going to talk today about the roadmap to commercialization. Where are the bumps, and has COVID added some new off ramps? We have four very distinguished guests, and we just the logistics before I get too far into it. We are going to leave you all of our attendees, cameras off, so we can figure out who's who on the screen. And if you'd like to ask a question, please use the question function at the bottom, and we will do our best to incorporate it as quickly as possible. We are going right to 9:30, so there'll be plenty of time. I'd like to introduce, I'm Laurie Halloran, one of the co-founders of Crush, Halloran Consulting. Crush is geared toward bringing best practices and insights to the leaders of tomorrow in life sciences. And so with that in mind, we thought this topic would be a really good choice for those of you who are in early stage or mid stage life science companies and are really in planning mode for the future. So I'd like to introduce Nerissa Kreher, Chief Medical Officer of Tiburio Therapeutics, Michael Castagna, CEO of Mannkind, Randa, Vice President of Market Access, HEOR, and Public Policy at Mycovia, and Alex Santini, Executive Vice President and Chief Commercial Officer at Lexicon Pharmaceuticals. The thesis of our topic today is that biotechnology companies have to prove to the regulatory agencies, their business partners, and their investors that they can produce and support their products consistently and safely once they receive marketing approval. The most productive route to implement a project, the most productive route to this is to implement a project that sets up some standard processes long before the marketing submission takes place. So planning and executing a successful launch is complicated and must be tailored to both the product and the market. It requires sustained and coordinated activity across multiple departments. Our panelists have been personally involved in the successful launch of a broad range of transforming therapies in both large pharma and small biotech companies in Europe and the United States. So I will let them introduce themselves as they go, and I will jump right into the questions because I'm sure everyone wants to hear from you. So where we start really is in the planning process of this. If you are planning the resources and the budgets that are required for a successful launch, you need to start several years out, especially if you're new to the commercial markets. What factors do you need to consider in that planning? And I'll just ask for folks to chime in. I think Nerissa has some comments, and we can start off with Nerissa.
Sure, happy to. So I'm the Chief Medical Officer, and my background is building medical affairs and clinical development teams in rare diseases. You know, as I think about it from the standpoint of preparing for launch from the medical affairs perspective, you really do have to think about this early. Think about building out your medical science liaison team early. And when I say early, you know, I'm thinking sort of phase 3 so that you are preparing to be able to go out. Your KOL development obviously has started much earlier than that. You have KOLs joining you early on, even in phase 1, depending on the type of product you're developing. From a rare disease perspective, the other thing to consider, of course, is patient advocacy. And patient advocacy is something that needs to start early in a company, again, especially in the rare disease space, but I think that applies to other products as well.
Okay. Do you want to hear from Alex? What are your thoughts here?
Well, good morning. I'm Alex Santini, Chief Commercial Officer at Lexicon Pharmaceuticals. And my background is similar to Nerissa in that I have been responsible for building a fully integrated cross-functional commercial team to prepare a company to launch their first brand. And in doing so, you certainly have to think about what are the core functions that are going to be required for a successful launch. And in doing so, you certainly have to think about your marketing team, sales team, your market access team, and your business analytics team. And in the context of thinking about those four core functions, you start to think about, 2.5 years, 3 years out, are you going to build a fully integrated team? Are you going to rent components of it? Are you going to create a hybrid model where you'll create a core management group that will lead those functions, and then you could hire third-party resources from external organizations? And once you made that determination as to whether or not you're going to build or borrow, you really need to start thinking about the planning process. To Nerissa's point, there are going to be components of your overall plan, such as your pricing strategy, your policy strategy, your market access payer strategy that has to really begin very early on in that phase 3 setting, so that you have an opportunity to potentially even shape that remaining clinical program if need be.
Okay. Laura, your points on this.
Yeah, good morning, Laura, Randa. Similar to both Nerissa and Alex's experiences, I've spent a significant part of my career building commercialization from development companies. And I think one of the key things is we always have to start with a strategy, and then we have to secure the alignment and really build out the resources and budgets. And it's been interesting kind of over the time and over the 4 companies that I've been at, how different companies and management teams actually secure that alignment. The last company I was at took 10 executive team days that we actually went offsite, built our formal strategic kind of planning guide. And from that, what we actually decided, what was our vision? What were the 5 key long-term goals over the next 7 to 10 years that we were really going to focus on? Where were we going to play? What was our therapeutic categories? What was the initial? What was our second position? What were the geographies? Were we just going to be a US-based corporation, or were we going to go into ex-US? Were we going to build strategic partnerships? Focus on how were we going to win as a team? Were we going to be first in class, or we were going to then have, follow-on label expansions? What was our pricing strategy? What was our focus on patient services? Really getting that alignment. And then the how. What was going to be our capabilities? Were we going to be known as this high science that, produces amazing biology, pathway knowledge, strong manufacturer, clinical and medical strength, and we were going to evolve over to a top-notch commercial, fully integrated biopharmaceutical company, really defining, what capabilities it really took. But ultimately, I think the key for us was really aligning over and over and over, how are we going to win? And getting that management alignment over and over again, just to completely drive us down that pathway.
Okay, great first thoughts. This is obviously taking a company to a metamorphosis, because you really have to think about the shared services, back office functions, etc. What are your lessons learned? One big lesson learned from you in considering that first launch? And maybe I'll start with Alex here.
So I would say the one thing that you really, really have to take into consideration is don't underestimate the amount of time it takes to put some of these functions in place, and the amount of time it takes to really get some of the third-party partnerships up and running and provide you with adequate time to do the work that has to get done. So that's been a lesson learned for me. I worked in several different companies where we did not have, I would say, adequate time frame to prepare for a launch, and conversely, worked for a company like Lexicon, where I've had sufficient amount of time to prepare for a launch, and it really makes a big difference in terms of your execution. So I would say that would be a key deliverable. And then the other thing is, Also, don't underestimate some of the capability of some of the third-party organizations that are out there that could really be of value to you when you're going through this dialogue of, do I build or do I rent or borrow? There are some organizations that really are quite good at their particular core capability.
Okay, Michael, we haven't heard from you. I absolutely know you have a few lessons learned that you could share with us.
Yeah, no, good morning, and thank you for having me today, Laurie. Just to build on a couple of themes here, I think the first is, what Laura said around alignment, and I think that lay out a clear strategy and clear alignment across functions. I find sometimes when that doesn't happen, everyone's kind of going in different directions as you're getting ready for launch. There's a push and pull type atmosphere, which is difficult. But I think to what Alex said, I see what happens in a lot of companies. Like, we had to literally get this product back from Sanofi with Mannkind, and in 3 months we built an entire commercial infrastructure, medical infrastructure. And for those who have done this, imagine building out medical affairs, pub planning, Salesforce, IT, everything in 12 weeks. And we launched it. And so it wasn't perfect, but we got it off the ground. But to Alex's point, and everyone probably on this call, the biggest thing when we were not a commercialization company, we were just an R&D manufacturing company. So we didn't have any of these capabilities. And I know a lot of companies are in a situation where they're getting ready to launch, and if you've been an executive that's been burned by, you get ready to launch, you think everything's going great, and then you get held up by the FDA for some reason. It makes you really scared, or funding resources. You're like, I'm going to wait until my risk is cleared. And that's somewhat what happened here at Mannkind. They had 2 CRLs over the decade, and that really just set the company back, tremendously. And so, you could see, I know Lexicon, you guys are well prepared and had a delay, and that, it sets you up for a lot of expenses, and then you're kind of just trying to figure out how to rejigger your company until you can get that certainty with the FDA. And so just Mannkind was a great example where we did not get a disruptive technology. You're changing 100 years of habit in a way that, treating a disease that's never been treated in a physiologic way. But did you have all the thought leaders on board? Did you have clinical trials in the right places? Did you have the education of the nurses and all the other surround sound around diabetes? I think Mannkind, I wasn't here, so I can't comment on what they were thinking, but I think a lot of that was expected to be done by the partner when they launched, and the partner had licensed the drug less than 12 months before launch. They had 6 months. So a lot of that work was just never done. So we've been playing catch up, as an example on our side, where we had to get publication planning, our data wasn't out there, understanding how to dose the product wasn't out there, all that stuff we had to do while the product was on the market, which is the worst possible thing in the world. But we got through it, and we're finally coming out on the other side of that. But that's an example. We've spent the last 3 years literally doing all the things we're talking about.
Wow. Laura, anything else to add here from your experience?
Thanks, Laurie. It's interesting. You've got to do all this planning, then you've got to get the launch out. But then what we also have to think is go long. So, while you're doing all this commercial year, that first year executing the launch, what the investors and, want us to focus on is what's the long-term revenue and profit prospects. So we make sure we have to have the right, opportunity either in the labs, or we have to have a licensing and acquisition strategy that has this internal growth, engine behind it. So it's all that balancing act of all the prep work prior to the launch, then all the launch readiness and execution flawlessly, but also planning long to make sure that it's a viable commercial organization.
So you've talked about this, but when you think about, everybody's talked about hiring and planning, but what about infrastructure? What kinds of things?
I think infrastructure today is easier than it was 10, 15 years ago, meaning, the IT solutions are turnkey, a lot of stuff's based on the cloud. If you have all the infrastructure, great. But I think when it just comes to like some of the back end support things, I feel like things are a lot easier today to get off the ground than they were a while ago. And there's a lot more consultants available in third parties. So I find that having a virtual team today is way easier than it was, 10, 15 years ago. People were talking, or you never think about hiring a talent in a different state who's not going to be co-located with the executive team or the launch team. And I feel like today, COVID just reinforces that's easier to do than ever.
So we haven't really talked about COVID. What in the rest of your views is COVID going to be impacting on the launch development and planning? Not necessarily from your specific experience, but what do you think, or what are you hearing?
So I would say that from my standpoint, what I've seen directly is the need to remain relevant with key stakeholders. You know, so you're certainly operating in a virtual environment, and you don't want to inundate clinicians or other stakeholders with just a lot of correspondence that's not meaningful. You really need to determine what is it that your stakeholders are in need of during this crisis, and ensure that you're delivering that relevant material. If you now are in a launch mode and you're ready to launch a brand during the COVID environment, and I have two colleagues that have done just that. Again, who are those key stakeholders that you're going to be engaging? How do they want to be engaged? How are you going to deliver that relevant information? How are you going to deliver it in a consistent and timely manner? And how is that interaction going to work? So you need to make sure that the web enabling capability is there, the technology is in place to allow that exchange to occur. And then you need to think about what are other vehicles by which you can disseminate information to those key stakeholders. So in my opinion, we've been operating in this COVID environment for the last 3.5 months, and we have been, fortunately, we've done very, very well. We've gotten praise from clinicians in terms of the materials that we have provided them and the support that we've provided them. And I would just think that it's important that you ask those colleagues, those stakeholders, what are they most in need of, and how could I be of value to them?
Okay. Anybody else?
I think, piggybacking off of what Alex said, is I think that the playbook is completely gone, and we're all in this new phase that we have to have a new playbook. But to Alex's point, is we have to be really attuned to our stakeholders, because I think that we've got a new normal coming, and we've got to figure out how they want to see us, how they want to hear our value proposition, how they want to interact with us. So I think it's going to take very seasoned people that know how to work with our stakeholders in a very remote kind of experience, and really be able to pull that input from stakeholders and bring it in, because we're going to have to modify our strategies. It's going to change. The playbook's going to change, but we just have to be able to be resilient and move forward in this new way that we're going to have to launch products.
I think internally, the internal stakeholders are critical as well, right? We think about our management team culture. We think about our ability to communicate with our employees, making sure that people aren't siloed or left out of conversations. So it's not only external stakeholders that have to be considered. We really have to think about the culture of our company, the culture of our management team, and how we're communicating throughout the company as well.
So along those lines, I'm shifting a little bit, and this is a little bit more on COVID as well as launching and commercialization in the new world. How do you think the development team has to be considered to accurately plan for this? And Nerissa, I'm sure this is a question that you've been dealing with, so you may be our first stop here.
Sure, I'll take that. So, reflecting on this and my learnings over 15 years in industry, don't underestimate the importance of your target product profile, right? So the whole management team, really the whole company, needs to be aligned around the target product profile. It's very difficult as a clinical development person to develop a drug if you don't know what your commercial partner wants to put out on the market. So I really see the target product profile as a playbook for what we should be doing as a development team. And, that doesn't just include what is my label going to look like, but it includes things like, what does Laura need to talk to payers? What do payers want? What do the physicians want? Mike mentioned nurses, patients, really thinking about all aspects of the people that you need to be generating data for. And it's not just physicians.
Do you think a lot of companies, and this is, I'm off script here, but do you think a lot of companies don't think about commercial when they're starting their programs? It never even occurs to them to do that long range planning?
I think it really depends on the type of team you have at a company. If you're a newco that's really built around R&D and scientists, you know, it's a company that's spun out of an academic university, perhaps, built by scientists. Maybe a slightly different view than if you have a CEO that comes with commercial experience and commercial or marketing and sales background. So really the leadership in the company will drive a lot of that. As a chief medical officer, you know, I pride myself in really trying to think about all aspects through commercialization, and maybe I bring a little bit of a different slant, probably from working with Mike years ago. He trained me early. But, you know, I think that it really depends on the kind of people sitting around the table, but certainly it is very important. And I would say trying to bring that kind of talent into the company, or at least that kind of thinking into the company early, is really critical to success.
So this is really related to what the C-level team and the board should be thinking about as they're thinking about this. What do those companies, you know, in those phase one stages need to be thinking about in their vision for the future? There's a lot, and you've all been in companies that didn't do it. So, what should key components for as they're sitting in phase one to this for the strategy to consider around commercialization?
I think one of the first things is, you know, where are you in the lineup? Especially, you know, how disruptive is your technology, and are you a follow-on or you're a leader? And that really starts to drive how you need to be thinking. Because if you're first to market, you got to take a very different tone and stance and talent base than if you're a fast follower or disruptor. So I think, you know, that's one of the questions here is like, if you're oncology, phase one to phase two could be 1 year and you're launching. Things can go a lot faster in some of these diseases, and so your time to preparation is a lot less. And so I think it's, you know, part of it is, you know, where like when I was in hepatitis C back in 2005 with Pharmacet, I remember building the models out, and we basically predicted that the first company to launch is going to make all the money and cure everybody, and everyone after that, you know, good luck. And that's kind of how that played out. I mean, you know, yes, some Abbott and a couple others made some money, but Gilead just ate it up, right? And I feel like they had to buy their way to first. But it worked, and you know, it was great for patients, and it was a great drug. But you know, if you're first to market and you're curing a population or you got a vaccine, I mean, that, you know, who's left and who's second and third, and so I think those are some of the things that if I'm that early at phase one, that's what I'm trying to understand. I don't want to develop a drug with the expectation that my competitors are going to fail, right? I want to figure out how I get it. If I'm behind, I want to get ahead, or I want to let them build the market and I follow behind with the better technology. I feel like those are all the types of things I'd be thinking about at phase one. But Nerissa, you've been there a couple times lately. So,
Alex, you want to weigh in here?
I would say that one of the things that the board, if the board was answering this question, they probably first would want to make a determination. If you're a discovery and development company, are you going to bring it all the way to market? Are you going to develop that drug to commercialize it? Because that's a very significant investment and decision that the company is going to make to be a fully integrated biopharmaceutical company. Many companies don't take it all the way. They'll develop it and then they'll partner it out, or they'll sell the asset. So I think that's fundamental to, I think, the decision. Once that decision is made to, say, commercialize it and to become a fully integrated model, then the build out of that commercial infrastructure is quite a substantial investment. Board needs to really fully understand, to do it right. So if you're going to launch the brand, and if you're going to have a successful launch, you need to make certain that all the key capabilities are in place early enough to be able to make a difference.
And how about the CMO? And anybody can answer this. Is the early stage CMO the right person to launch And if not, what do you need to look for as you move to a commercial phase?
Nerissa.
Yeah.
If your CMO is Nerissa, probably you're okay.
Yeah, that's
So, again, I think that really depends. It depends on the mindset, and I think of it as two things. Curiosity. Does the CMO want to learn how to work in a business, right? Are they science oriented and that's where they're comfortable, or do they want to be curious and flexible and learn about taking a company all the way through? So it's certainly not to say that a CMO with only early phase experience can't do it, but they really need to have that ability to want to learn about it and be a partner to their commercial team, and others on the team to really learn how to do it. So it comes with that business mindset, right? You have to realize that you are in a company that is financially oriented, and if you have that mindset, it can really work and it can be a lot of fun. But you just really have to explore that as the board, as the CEO that's looking at their chief medical officer.
So this is a good time to factor in a question that came up as we were talking. In that whole mindset of transitioning from a clinical stage to a med affairs, having to have med affairs integrated, can you translate the phase 3 to expected years from NDA? Because as Michael said earlier, there's some that don't go all the way through. So how many years from launch do you need to think about this?
Yeah, so this ties back to something Mike was mentioning. So, and I would say in the rare disease space as well, oncology perhaps. Are you the first product for this disease? That's a really different world than if you're a follow-on, right? So, has the market already been developed or not? And if it hasn't, then you need more lead time. An example, when I was at Innovia, the product was ultimately acquired by Alexion. We were working in hypophosphatasia, a very rare disorder, and literally physicians confused it with another type of bone disease. So we had a lot of education to do, and our lead time there, I would say, was at least a couple of years, if not closer to sort of 3 years out, as far as really starting to lay that groundwork. So I would say in that 2 to 3 year time frame from NDA. But again, that does depend on how developed the market is. Are there already KOLs? Do people recognize the disease? So some of that is really dependent on disease state.
Okay, shifting a little bit to a completely different topic around payers. And this is in everyone's expertise, and often is not in an early stage company's expertise. When you're thinking about engaging, how do you do that preparatory planning to realistically plan and engage, and have a value-based mindset? I think, Laura, this might be a good question for you.
Thinking back about some of the work that I did when I was at Regeneron, and I think it also builds off the phase 1 story, going right into phase 2. One of the things that we did, similar to what Nerissa was describing, was we're building a whole new market first with Dupixent, with atopic dermatitis. So we were not only branding company, branding leadership, branding a new therapeutic category, branding a product, and then branding a product that had 16 indications in the lab with big markets, asthma, COPD, other, component area. So one of the things that I worked with Len Schleifer, with the board, and our partner Genzyme with, is we actually post phase 2, we actually did 9 payer meetings. It was before the ESI Cigna merger and Aetna and CVS. We did 9 payer meetings times 9 times, talking through phase 2 all the way up until approval. And it took that many meetings to really understand what were the clinical value, what was the economic value, what was the humanistic value, because we were creating this market. You know, we also, because we have pre-approval ability with PI now, with, you know, some of the new guidance that we have out in the payer space, we could start, you know, post the Hep C market. One of the things payers want to see is predictability. You know, they want to know what the targeted patient profile is, what Nerissa mentioned, and how many patients in their population are they going to see? How many can they expect? So building all that out, you know, making sure that they have predictability, making sure that they understand, you know, how are we going to manage this through utilization management? What does patient affordability look like? So the importance really is getting out early. Over and over and over again, we've seen successful launch, get input from stakeholders, feed it back internally, you know, modify your strategy, and continue to actually build the strategy to get alignment. And so that early engagement all the way through R&D phase 2 with input into phase 3 with clinical input, endpoints, and patient outcomes actually drove to, you know, a very, very successful, as many know, biologic launch that launched in March 2017. And the outcome was day 1, we had, you know, the access with 75% of patients, physician attestation, and quick utilization management. And we were quickly able to get the drug through the pipeline and into patients' arms, which was, you know, ultimately our goal. So I think a lot of plan, and early engagement, but really making sure that all the right stakeholders are really involved so that, you know, you have input into it so that you have a launch plan to do it together.
Michael, do you want to weigh in?
Yeah, I think just what Laura said, I think in smaller companies are going to think differently because they're probably going to take a little more risk than some bigger companies. But I think Laura was in a very unique situation where, you know, if you go back 8 years ago, people were afraid to talk to payers about a launch and pricing before launch. And so you almost waited till right before launch, and there was always all this guidance internally. And I remember sitting there with, when I was at Amgen and Sanofi and Regeneron were talking to payers, and yet we didn't even engage them yet. And I'm like, look, they're already in the discussions and are ahead of us in launch because they had bought a voucher and they were preparing the market and the pricing and setting the tone, which ultimately did that for the PCSK9 market. And then, you know, and then I think what happened, and you got to be careful with these small companies because you're assuming a certain, I'll call it wholesale acquisition cost. And then all of a sudden, by the time you add in your wholesaler fees as a small company is very different than a big company. If you got a specialty network, that's another fee. The payer rebates, if you're launching in a 1 of 2 market where you got a competitor right on your heels within a year, payers will negotiate you down. And I think having good strategic payer people by your side who have the confidence to say, no, I'm going to call their bluff. Because what I learned, unfortunately, through biosimilars, Nerissa and I worked in growth hormone 15 years ago, and payers were just chewing down 50% rebates back then. But if you didn't have the confidence to say no, they just want the money. They don't really care about the innovation sometimes. And sometimes they do, and they want to help their patients. But at the same time, as I was building out the biosimilar business back in 2008, we realized that we were not going to disrupt the brand incumbent, and they weren't just going to kick everybody off. So I feel like you got to just understand, what is your goal with payers? Is your goal just to get access and have a prior auth? Or is your goal to clear all hurdles? But it's not realistic, no matter how low you price a drug sometimes. There's always going to be prior auths. And then are you in a generic market where you're going to be a step edit in migraine or PCSK9s, for example? You know, you have to decide within your payer strategy, what is your ultimate launch position? And are you comfortable with that position? And what are you buying? Because sometimes you're paying a lot of money, but you're still paying for authorizations, you're still paying for step edits, or you're paying for second or third line. It's like, well, why are you doing that? They have to cover that in most cases. And then do you build a better reimbursement support model, or do you build a larger access team? So I think all that has to go into that planning. And there's no one model I've seen out there yet. Maybe Laurie, you've seen it, but I feel like every brand's a little bit unique in the sequence here.
How early on do they, if you're going to commercialize, I have 2 questions, two good ones. if you're going to commercialize, how long do you have to really engage before expected launch? And if you are thinking about selling the company, selling the product to another company, do you even start talking with payers? Anybody who wants to take it.
I think you do, because if I'm a company that's looking at your asset, you certainly want to know what the payer position is going to be regarding that innovation. I certainly would ask those questions in any due diligence. What do the payers think of this brand and category? What do they think of your differentiation? How is the brand going to be reimbursed? How could it potentially be priced? I mean, there are numerous examples in the marketplace, recent examples, without mentioning any specific products, that have failed dismally because the payer receptivity and the payer reimbursement was just not there at launch. And those brands never fully recovered. It took years for those brands to get reset, get repriced, and then in essence get relaunched into the marketplace. And they've lost a considerable amount of momentum and a considerable amount of innovation value because they didn't do their homework appropriately with payers. And to Laura and to Michael's point, I believe that we have a tremendous opportunity with payers today that we did not have many, many years ago. The opportunity to have dialogue 18 to 24 months in advance of a brand coming to the marketplace is certainly there. They want to have dialogue with companies. They want to review your target product profile. They want to review the budget impact model. They want to review the epidemiology data. They want to understand how this product or brand is going to be different than current standard of care. And I look at that as an opportunity.
And I think, Laurie, just to piggyback one more component of that, if I may.
I was just about to ask you.
I think, what's interesting is if we think about Europe and ex-US, right? We've had these bi-directional conversations with regulatory manufacturers and the HTAs for years. What we're starting to see in the United States is more and more of this. We were at Bio and, Dr. Steve Miller and Kent Rogers were actually saying, please, manufacturers, come in and talk to us very early. So I think this is really something that, what's happened before is all these conversations have happened in silos. And, Michael referenced the PCSK9s. And quite honestly, if we, it followed on the Hep C marketplace, but quite honestly, payers did a great job of controlling what patients got it and who didn't get it and control the market very tightly. I think what we've learned since that time, those of us that have been in this space, is go in early, get that alignment, not only get the alignment with payers, but also include Steve Pearson and ICER, and really start, our person that's doing third-party reviews of clinical efficacy and outcomes and cost effectiveness, and include all those components and stakeholders really to help us, get the stakeholders behind us to successfully market. Again, early, 18 to 24 months.
So let's drill down on that, because you had some really good comments in our prep call around phase 2 and what you're talking about in phase 2. So can you elaborate a little bit on that, Laura?
Yeah, so I think what's important in phase 2 is, is really getting out and, whether it's with this, CEO to CEO, top to top, whether it's with program clinical managers, but really getting payers to understand our phase 2. Then when we move, as we develop our phase 3 programs, what we see is typically, to Alex and Michael's point earlier, is that we typically, historically, I've been in this business for 23 years, but early days, we didn't come out and we didn't share all this information. We came out, when we got approval. And so then payers were saying, what about this endpoint? What about this patient outcome? What's critical is we have those early discussions before phase 3 so that we can work with, the folks in, our program group to actually build in those components into the phase 3. Very important, because I think to, back to even Nerissa's point, then what we do is we start bridging the two organizations. What's our targeted patient profile? What are the components of the clinical study? What do payers need to see? And I think that's going to be critical as we move forward so that there's this predictability around both size, patient profile, and, the financial impact.
Nerissa, any comments about HEOR?
Yes, I mean, you probably see me nodding my head in vehement agreement, right? So just to add on to what Laura was saying, I think this is a great opportunity for the commercial health access, payer access teams to really bring their clinical colleagues in. So, you know, having sat in on payer advisory meetings, it's a great opportunity for clinical to hear what the payer wants. And clinical really needs to hear that and incorporate that into clinical development, right? The last thing you want is to be in the situation that Alex was describing, where you are ready to launch and then you find out there's some data that a payer wants that would differentiate your product, that would help you with payer access and pricing, and you're short because you didn't incorporate that into your clinical program. So, you know, this applies certainly in the rare disease space, but I think across all, that really bringing your clinical colleagues into those meetings, you know, when Laura's planning those meetings, having someone from clinical sit in that then can be a partner in developing that and not just focusing on the primary efficacy endpoint. The last thing I would say is some of these endpoints that payers want are often, you know, more, I don't know if it's difficult, but let's just say more difficult to acquire. So they're patient-reported outcomes. They're things that might be a little more difficult to incorporate into a trial. They take more time. The PIs might not want them, but they're really critical. And I think hearing that from the payers really just helps the clinical team to take that in and buy into building it into their clinical programs.
Okay. We've talked a lot about internal clinical. How do you, as a CEO, Michael, how do you engage with MSLs and KOLs? How do you best engage with them?
As a company or me personally? So
Either.
yeah. Well, you know, I have a science background, so I'm probably driving more people crazy some days than others, because, you know, I love both the business side and the science side. But, you know, I think with, you know, MSLs are probably becoming more and more valuable as we go forward, because I think it's getting harder and harder for reps to access a lot of these institutions. And as you get ready for launch, having a good MSL team who understands their role and the clear communication that they're trying to educate, I think helps you prepare the market so that you have thought leaders ready to go. And that to me was one of the biggest gaps as we look at our product being a disruptive insulin. You know, number one, you didn't have the payer discussions, and number two, you didn't have the medical team out there educating the market on the physiologic insulin that's completely different than anything else we've seen. And we suffered from that. You can't do it after launch; it's too late. So you didn't have KOLs from the rooftop, you know, shouting with the FDA to get it reviewed and approved nicely. And then even when you think about guidelines and you think about the influence guidelines have at launch versus 3 years after launch, or the, you know, how that shapes the you know, discharge protocols. If you got a hospital and you got a hospital discharge product, there's a lot that I think an MSL, a good MSL team and a good leader of the MSL team can help pull through that area, especially with the KOLs. I find today, depending on your disease, KOLs can make or break you. And diabetes, you know, it's such a latent adoption for any person's technology, unfortunately. But once you got the 10 or 20 people starting to shout, then the next 40 follow, and then the next 400 follow. But I find rheumatology and endocrinology are two of the more laggards, I'll call them, in terms of change, where oncology was very progressive, and infectious disease, where I worked in HIV and hepatitis, was very progressive because people were dying and you didn't have time on your side. So I find that disease state also makes a huge difference from my experience. But Alex, I mean, the rest of you guys have been in this as well.
So there's a couple detailed questions here from Michael that I think it's a good try to drill down a little bit now before we move on. How did you go about doing the implementation? Did you hire experienced people, consultants, other? And then what was the push to get launched in 12 weeks?
I think in our particular case, you had a company who had no cash and spent 20 years building a product. And, you know, there's people who needed that product, but you know, the worry was, do you keep the product on the market? Do you take it off the market and relaunch it? Do you have continuity of supply? And I think where things were at that time, we wanted to have continuity of supply and keep it on the market. So therefore, we made the choice to fix a lot of things while the product was on the market, like packaging and pricing and clinical data. So that was a harder choice to go about. I've seen other companies literally take a product off the market, give it for free for 12 to 18 months, fix a bunch of things, and then relaunch it. Look, I would just say I'm one of the few people who've launched products second and third times. It generally doesn't happen in this industry, and I think that was the real problem here. Was if you were going to keep this product alive at all, taking it off may not bring it back again. And so that's where we kept going in that 12. We had less than 6 months from notification it was already on the market, launched through Sanofi, to taking it back over was literally 4 months. So we didn't have a lot of time. If anyone thinks about launching a product, getting it registered, getting packaging in the supply chain, we had 4 months. You didn't have a choice. We had to get it done. And so that was really more of a means of necessity than desire.
I see a lot of head shaking. Alex, you have things to add here?
Well, I mean, I think, Michael's scenario is not something that any company looks forward to. It's challenging enough to do it the right way. It's really challenging when you're having to do it from behind the 8 ball. And all of those kind of infrastructure capabilities that you have to put in place in a 12 to 14 week period of time is just mind boggling. It's just challenging. I mean, there's certain things that just take more time, and that 12 to 16 week period will allow. But I will say this, that you really need to think about, again, is the value of the brand there? Obviously, Michael thought that with Afrezza, there was certainly inherent value there. There was differentiation there, and that we can go out it alone and make this brand a successful brand. So it's worthy of us relaunching it and reestablishing it in the marketplace through Mannkind. So that was fundamental to do we do it or not. And it was a good decision because it is a good brand and it does have differentiation, and you guys are taking it now to the next level. But a company needs to have the inherent chutzpah to want to take that on. That is not an insignificant decision that Michael just referenced here. I've been involved in other decisions like that, where companies have said, we're not ready to take that on. It's although the brand could have been a good brand, they decided either to sell the asset off or to put it out to pasture.
Wow. It's an awful lot of time and money wasted if you do that.
No.
Yeah. Laurie, and we're a great example because I have a lot of development companies, which I'm still shocked, but innovation will never end. That's the good news here in this world. But I think literally in the last few weeks, I've had quite a few people come to me with new innovative insulins. And I even hear the nonprofits saying we're funding new innovative insulins. And I'm like, on one hand, you're saying we want everyone to have access to $20 and commoditize the pricing. And on the other hand, you want someone to come out with a new innovative insulin. We spent $2 billion in 20 years to bring out a new version of insulin that's been around for 100 years at the end of the day. But then everyone doesn't want to pay for it, and no one's lobbying for it and making sure you have access for patients. And to me, that's when you get your innovation event, you really better decide, are you disrupting a new product and building a new market, or are you just replacing a product? And what do you think that price point's going to be? Because we've taken a very different strategy. Because of the disruptive product, it's a higher value product, and our economic story is a little bit different than just, hey, here's an injectable insulin, we're just going to make it cheaper. And that's really the mindset out there today. But when we look at outcomes in this particular disease, they've not changed for 2 decades. So I go back to payers and I say, what are you paying for? Because we keep adding drugs and adding costs, but yet your outcomes are identical as they were 20 years ago. And what good is that? And then Alex was working on a great drug to help in type 1 especially. But I think that's, to me, I'm always admiring people coming like, hey, we got this new insulin, we're doing this to fix this. And I'm like, we do that either directly or indirectly. And how are you going to get pricing in 5 to 8 years on that drug? I feel bad. I'm like, don't even want to waste your time. But there's 3 or 4 people now working on new insulins. And I'm like, I don't know how you're going to get the cost down or who's going to pay for it. It's a big disease, so I get it. But I think we've been burned. So it's hard for me to kind of really look at those.
Well, and that kind of brings up the whole concept of patient assistance programs, which are great when you hear them on the ad, but what kinds of What kinds of experiences have you had, and this is for everybody, with patient assistance programs, and what lessons have you learned? Want to start, Laura?
Yeah, I think, thanks, Laurie. I think, patient assistance, patient affordability, what we have seen over time is for the commercial patient, we have, we go back and look at failed launches, and a lot of it has to do with utilization management, because we're able to do a lot more patient assistance for the commercial patient. I think what the challenge has been is products that have high Medicare population. How do we build a patient affordability strategy, especially for that when, it's a government patient and we don't have the means to provide as much assistance directly to the patient? So, back to, value proposition, the evidence generation from an HEOR perspective, and really those early conversations with payers and building your strategy is really making sure you have the right pricing strategy that patients can afford the drug. Because we have seen that that's the decision maker of whether or not they pick up the drug at the pharmacy or not. We really, you have to be very strategic about how you build that into the strategy. Lots of ways to do it, but lots of conversations really that need to happen at a very strategic leadership level.
And Laura, that's a really, really good point. So on the Medicare side, again, as you think about your brand, if you're doing epidemiology work on your brand and you determine that you're a heavy, your patient population is more than likely going to be a Medicare population, you need to have a complete understanding of the benefit design associated with that Medicare recipient. And that's all healthcare policy work that's originating out of CMS. And it's about patient affordability, because pharma companies cannot in any way, shape, or form subsidize that copay or that coinsurance assistance. There are many, 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 many Medicare patients that cannot afford the copay or the coinsurance obligation that drug would entail. And as a result of that, they go without going on drug. So again, if your brand has a heavy Medicare constituency, and you don't have a vehicle by which that benefit design could work on behalf of that patient, that drug may not do well at all upon launch. So you need to think about that, and you need to think about what strategies can you employ, either policy strategies or reimbursement strategies that could help offset that challenge.
Just building upon Alex and Laura, I think even just taking within Medicare, you got Part B and Part D, and you develop back in the early development phase, is it going to be a self-administered drug or is it going to be a buy and bill drug? And sometimes when you get to some of these diseases, you could go either way in early development. And if you don't design that in your development program, you may be stuck on one or the other, and then you got to spend years trying to build the other one. Or one of the drugs I had was very public, was Orencia. They were in the Part B space, and we were launching a sub-Q, which would have launched in the Part D space. And then we had a huge internal debate. Well, how do you price it? And then is there going to be, does Medicare start to match the two prices and blend them? And so it became and then do they stop covering at a certain point because more than 50% of your sales go to Part D? You get all these nuances as you think about, Laura, where you were with Dupexent and all the indications. You start to think about how the next markets, the dosing will be, the administration route. Prolia and XG were two great examples. One's in oncology, one's in bone. And, Prolia could be self-administered, but it's been physician-administered for the last decade. And so there's all kinds of great examples, but, unfortunately everyone thinks payers one bucket, and it's literally one bucket divided by 50, divided by, 5 within each state. And so if you don't have someone like a Laura at your table starting to pre-plan, this gets out of hand pretty quickly. And sometimes if a CEO and board aren't thinking about this until late, it's too late in many cases. So it's very hard to catch up once you don't price the drug right or put some of these development plans in place.
I can't not ask about ex-US and what you have to consider as a factor if you're thinking about ex-US development, because it's obviously so relevant here.
Yeah.
Who could weigh in on that? Just even high level about what you need to think about. If you think you own the world.
COGS. Can you get your costs down? I mean, I think that's, a lot of, if you got a biologic or you got, a drug in the U.S., the pricing is always incredible in the U.S. and profits are going to be incredible in the U.S. because of the free market. But I think about, are you launching through a partner or are you launching yourself, depending on your company? And you know, if you're going through a partner, you better get your COGS down, because it's going to be a transfer price or some other mechanism. And if your COGS aren't low enough, you're in some of these orphan or specialty areas, it's going to be very hard to get there. And if you're going yourself, think about all the inefficiencies that exist in a small market that only has 10 million people or 20 million people. You just don't have the scale, but you still need medical, you still need payer, you still need marketing. So there's not a lot of profit in a lot of these markets. And I think that's, you know, fortunately, you know, the US is probably half the world's profits and the rest of the other half. But Laura and Alex, you guys have been in Nerissa, so.
Yeah.
I think the other part is, you know, what are the, you know, key markets, 20, 25 markets that you're really going to play in, right? Because I think the key is, and I think this is what we're starting to see evolution on, is international reference pricing. And, you know, we're going to see it again, probably, and, you know, with the new presidential and, you know, congressional session, where it's going to come up that potentially it'll have impact with the United States. So I think, you know, whether you do it alone or whether you do it with partners, you've got to be very critical, and you've got to have this cadence strategy that really has, you know, you map out, you know, what is the cadence of launch? What's the price? What are the implication reference points? Because what you don't want is a little company like, you know, Sweden or somebody else that, you know, doesn't have a lot of margin, doesn't have a lot of profitability, impacting, you know, your big behemoth United States, or, you know, whatever the component of reference pricing can be. So I think very thoughtfully, you've got to think about what are your key markets, what's the pricing strategy, and what's the cadence of all the launching.
Okay. So take a couple big picture views as we come into our last 30 minutes. We might start losing people. How would you say the landscape has changed in the last 10 years? Like, describe the value that you have seen happen with the value policy.
So let me just chime in here. I think from what I see is from 10 years ago to now, you know, the old model was, you know, you get regulatory approval and you put in guerrilla marketing teams with, you know, 4,000 field reps, and you go out there and you promote the brand that was just recently approved. And for the most part, you were rewarded. You know, you created high demand pretty quickly, and there wasn't a lot of pushback. That was 10 years ago, 15 years ago. Nowadays, 70% of brands fail to achieve their launch forecast. So that's a pretty significant, you know, 70% failure rate against what they had predicted. So this whole mantra of regulatory approval is going to guarantee you commercial success is gone. And I think that all those factors that we have been talking about, the landscape has changed, is that payers are not going to pay for a product that doesn't deliver value. Prescribers are not going to write a drug that doesn't have some level of differentiation. Patients are going to be restricted in taking products that they can't afford. So those landscape challenges you have to address. You have to address the payer challenges, you have to address the prescriber challenges, and you have to address the patient challenges.
And I think, right, I think kind of building on Alex's thought, I think, you know, the payer, you talk about changes in the landscape, you know, 10 years ago, you know, what we see in, you know, Michael referred to it as, you know, 5 by 5 by 25, you know, in every different state and so many different payers. What we're seeing right now is, with all the mergers and acquisitions, is we're seeing such large payers, you know, CVS, United, ESI, Cigna, you know, are, you know, 75 to 80% of the marketplace with just 3 payers. So we've got these big, you know, big organizations making big decisions. So, you know, the shift of how we really work with payers to bring value, both on a clinical, economic, and humanistic, is very different. I think also another piece that I would also add to the 3 keys of Alex's is policy. And I think that what we're going to see is more and more policy and regulations coming out that potentially, you know, could impact us. We recently saw, you know, from CMS, a Medicaid, you know, proposed rule out that, you know, instead of, you know, for example, giving 23.1 flat rebate to Medicaid, we might be able to start building out, you know, value-based outcomes contracts for Medicaid patients. So moving from this volume to value. And so I think what we're going to see is, the government's more engaged in payers trying to think about how they can, break down the drug costs. And, I think what we're seeing is this emergence of HEOR really come out not from just an HEOR epidemiology and, kind of looking at that side of it, but also looking at value policy is really, okay, we've got policy, but what's the financial implication, the economic implication to as we launch products? So I think all of those things are very different from when, where we are now, 10 years ago.
Okay, how about Nerissa? We haven't heard from you in a little while. Can you give us some?
Yeah, I would add another P, patients. So I think in the course of the last 10 or 15 years, the patient voice has become more and more always important, but more prevalent, right, in the discussion and earlier on, right, bringing in the patients, listening to what the patients really need and thinking about their needs, their wants in the development process. So that is something that I would say has changed in the course of my time in industry.
Okay. A good topic to hopefully keep people for after we go past the hour. Given what you've learned in your career in either difficult situations or deals gone bad, if you could go back in time and redo those things and fix them, what would you fix? And this is for everybody.
I would have joined Mannkind 10 years ago before the last CRL and got it right. But no, I think as you think about, a lot of these companies are in phase 2, 3, and they're thinking about an exit with a partner or a co-promoter, whatever they want to build U.S. infrastructure. I think a lot of it is you got to decide what's going to create the most shareholder value as an executive in the company. Is it going to be an exit? Is it going to be a collaboration? Do you have an R&D engine? All those are going to be really critical. And when you think about partnerships, if you're going to keep going like Mannkind did, and Lexicon at the end of the day, when you partner out your lead asset and you have other assets coming behind, think about marriages. 1 out of 2 end in divorce, and I've seen more drug deals going bad. And plan your exit package when you sign that deal, which I think everyone's all excited to get that partner. But sometimes these don't work out, and you should really think about protecting a smaller company. Big companies can survive regardless, but these small companies, they have not limited resources, money, and time. And when a big company puts all this effort towards something and then hands it back to you in shambles, you just can't take it all on at the same time. And Alex, you got so many studies you have to deal with at the same time. I don't know how you guys got through it. And we had a bunch of stuff commercially to get through, and it just weighed down the company and almost kills them. And I think it takes a good leadership team to bring it back and focus it in the right way, but really think about the downside risk as much as the upside is what you're excited about. That's just one piece of advice I would say looking back.
Now, I know there were some challenges along the way. How about Laura?
I think what I've seen is almost 50% of the leadership that starts, and I think that's even reflected in Michael and other people. They have a lot of turnover. When you're actually bringing an R&D company to a fully integrated pharmaceutical. I think at the same time, to Michael's point, is half the companies, destroy the shareholder value during, the 2 years following this product launch. I think when I step back and I think, what's critical to make sure that those two things, that you've got the right talent, you've got the right organizational effectiveness, you've got the right mapping, you've got the capital allocation trade-offs. Where are you going to spend your money and where are you going to get your biggest ROI? What are the program decisions that we've talked about early on all the way through? What are the strategic choices? I think you've got some core real key things that you've got to really do as you build, and making sure you almost like slow down to go long. And I think that's a really important component here. I think everybody wants to get in, roll your sleeve, and work in silos. The other key component I will tell you is alignment, and get people in cross-functional teams, especially because, especially when you go from an R&D company over to, a fully integrated biopharmaceutical, you'll bring in people like from big pharma and different places, and you have to be real critical about, making sure you've got this inclusion, back to some of the comments that Nerissa made, building your culture from, R&D bridging over to, the THIPCO, but also making sure people are aligned and really, you have those radical transparency conversations, but once you've had them, everybody's ready to execute flawlessly.
Nerissa, things you would do differently if you could fix things from the past or deals going bad.
So one thing I would add from a company where, things looked great, everything was moving right along, we were in phase 3, and then a bad safety signal, was contingency planning, and really taking some time as a management team to think about all of the different scenarios that might occur, and considering, if we had a crisis, what would we do? Who are the people we need to communicate to? And you really put yourselves at risk for being caught flat-footed if you haven't done some scenario planning and some crisis management planning.
Okay. And Alex, can you give us words of wisdom?
My experience has been, truth be told, when brands do well, everybody's a hero. Everybody's feeling pretty good about themselves. The brand was a success. The launch was a success. The company's doing well. But when the brand doesn't do well, there's a lot of finger pointing that goes on. And in my experience, things that I would do differently, not drinking the Kool-Aid when it comes to the target product profile of a drug. Drinking the Kool-Aid when you thought really looking at is the brand truly differentiated in the marketplace. Making sure that you are listening carefully to the stakeholders that are providing you very constructive feedback that you may not want to hear. Telling you that your baby may not be so beautiful. And figuring out a way to address those challenges really early on. And when I've been on brands where we have not done that, such as forecasting, irrational forecasting, you never recover from that. You kind of live by the sword, you die by the sword. So I would say, really be truthful to yourself, have an environment where you can have that transparent and open dialogue, that constructive debate, challenge each other. It doesn't look right, try to figure out a way to adjust, but don't dismiss it.
Okay. That's the questions that we've all prepared. So I wanted to, we are losing people. And most people are used to 60-minute Zoom. So I want to give everybody who's still on a few minutes if you want to have some questions that we haven't addressed. Specifics. Can use the Q&A at the bottom of the screen. And we'll take a couple, and then if not, we'll let everybody get on with their day with an extra 15 minutes off Zoom.
I mean, Laurie, while people are looking at questions, I think, and Nerissa hinted on this, is really think about that culture of your company that you're building up. I think a lot of that's shaped in the early stages of an R&D culture, and as you go into commercialization and medical affairs, culture is really strong, and making sure you got clear values and branding and what everyone we live by, and performance management. That's just another area we didn't touch on, but I think as a small company, these are things that generally when you start with 15 to 40 people, you're not worried about promotions and performance management, incentive systems, and those are some things that you got to build, and then all of a sudden you kind of grow through it. But that culture piece, especially in a virtual world today of COVID, if you're building this company and you're planning to go live, we may be in COVID for the next 9 to 12 months. So it's going to be very interesting, because there's a lot of drugs that are going to get approved, and a lot of us are going to be deciding, do I hire these sales reps? Do I hire more medical liaisons? Do I defer my launch for 6 more months? But that culture part will help shape some of the drive that your teams have, and incentives that you put in place. But that's just something we didn't touch on that I think is
That's a really great comment. And a lot of times people in small companies don't think about commercial, so they think of it as big pharma once you get there. If you can't, here's a couple good questions that have come in. If you're at a small company and you can't afford the type of commercial budget you would need at a big pharma, what are 2 or 3 things where you'd focus your pre-launch commercial planning budget?
Most of us, especially if you hire people from big pharma, you're going to get more requests for money than you're ever going to have as a small company. So I think it's, getting a really good marketer and a really good payer person by your side in commercialization, because really smart people will save you millions of dollars in consultants and market research and relationship that they can get in and get questions answered. And to me, that's one of the things I would focus on, is not always trying to compete with the big pharma brands, but work smarter and get really type A 10 people around you. I'll take Nerissa and Laurie and Alex any day on my team. And I think that's really what you want, is just really smart people working hard who can figure things out. But Laurie, Alex, what you got?
And there are people out there that you can engage without necessarily adding to the hiring team. Secondly, how are you planning forecasting with the data being generated in 2020? Anybody who wants to take that?
Well,
Guarantee you're wrong.
I think that, forecasting is not just your own data, but the epidemiology data, I think, is really not just a 1-year assessment. The unmet need in a particular marketplace, the number of patients that may exist with that particular disease, number of patients that are being unsatisfied, all that data is available to an organization for many, many, many years. And then if you're doing good payer research and you're getting that feedback regarding the current standard of care, you can start to think about, is there really going to be another need for an additional therapy to be added in, or are we satisfied with what we currently have? And you start to build the components of a forecast, not just on how you want to price your drug and how many patients you think are out there, but based upon the market data that will exist. You can have data from 2015, 16, 17, 18, 19, leading up to 20, that'll help inform your forecasting model.
The other thing I'd say is, we've all been on brands, and, the only thing guarantees your forecast will be wrong, and hopefully it's wrong in the right direction. More often than not, the last couple of years I've seen wrong they come in much, much lower. And I think, one thing we talked about is what's that first couple of years of the launch look like. I feel like some of these launches the last 3 or 4 years, I would almost discount the first year, because if you didn't prepare the payer market and you launch and you hit some headwinds, really year 1 starts in year 2, unfortunately, as you start to learn from those lessons and then pick up and get the payers back on track. Kind of a setback. So I think we'll look back and find that a lot of the launches didn't go well the first year or 2, and then got things back on track. And there's plenty of examples out there around that. But when it comes to forecasting, 2 things I would say we didn't touch on a lot, but as a CEO, sometimes the worst thing you can do is actually get revenue, because people like to buy the belief of what the future is going to be. And then when you actually got to deliver revenue and profits and cash flows, your market values collapse pretty quickly. And I think that's one thing, as you think about these forecasts when you're going public or you're talking pre-launch, you'll say, oh, it's $1 billion market or $5 billion total value. And then you launch and you get, 10, 50 million. It just crushes your expectations. So I think you got to be really managing and the analyst as a CEO and CFO team closely and giving them clear feedback on where you expect things to go and what headwinds you face, and just highlight the risk benefit in your forecast. And all forecasts are wrong. So I think it's just a challenge. And the second thing, Laurie, is really gross to nets. And so, how do you put that into your forecast? And is that going to be just a hole that you say it's going to be 20% and that's what we assume, or is it going to be 40, 50%? I find that, if you're off on gross to nets, I don't care what your forecast is. If your gross to nets are 40, 50%, now you got to double your volume you expected or cut your expenses. So just think about that gross to net assumption you're making in your models in phase 3, because I find gross to nets today, especially for small companies, are very dramatically different than they were a decade ago. And it's a lot harder. That's what I'll say today, to be a single product company than it ever has been.
I think just to kind of continue that conversation, I think, once you know that, right, ultimately the forecast, the gross to nets, what, is what you build your organization off. You build your budgets and you build your head count and your whole organization structure. So I think that, while, we all know that forecasts are wrong, a lot of the times I think you have to, back to like Nerissa's planning around, different scenario plannings. I think it's very critical that the board really realizes and understands the investment needed for that commercialization and, what the implications to those, 3 different scenarios, if we hit this, if we, hit base case or if we hit low scenario. And I think you've got to be able to, scale up or scale down as you progress through the, the life cycle of the launch. I think it's just really critical because that gap, especially in a single products, small startup company, it's not big pharma, so your costs are so much heavier, and I think you've got to make sure people understand that.
So, have any of you seen off ramps as a result of COVID? And if so, what? This is obviously an out of the box question, but it was part of our title.
Like getting out, I mean, or just slowing things down. I think it's just, I think COVID slowed down some companies and if you had an R&D engine and you were not commercially generating revenue and everything was in R&D, it's crushing you. Your programs slow down, your timelines slow down. I mean, a lot of these costs don't go away of management fees and running trials, as Nerissa will tell you.
Right.
So, do you shut down a program or pause one? I mean, Nerissa, I think you got a lot on the development side too.
Okay.
Yeah, in that situation, I mean, we've had to think about ways to continue to generate value, right? So if you're in a situation where your clinical trial had to be put on hold, are there other ways you can generate value? So looking at your whole plan, what are things that you can keep doing? And I'll just use an example, a natural history study, that's something that we could keep moving. While the clinical trial, we might be looking at what's happening there, but really evaluating what can we keep doing, what can we keep on track to continue to generate value. And that's the way we've been looking at it.
Okay.
The one area that I think has done very, very well in the COVID environment is the advocacy platform. Patients are very, very engaged, and probably because there's folks are hunkered down, they have time on their hands, they're able to join virtual presentations, they're able to tap into resources that are available to them. And in our organization, in the disease that we're in, the numbers are just unbelievably high for the patients that are actually gaining access to information and the advocacy initiatives that are made available to them at a 10 times higher rate than they were previously. And that's very, very encouraging because it shows that there is a need. They're tapping into it. And
Yep.
I think some of it is going to be sustainable because I think there's a fair number of new patients that may have been introduced to these platforms that may not have been aware that they were there. And again, if the information is, if it's relevant, if it's of value, they may keep coming back.
Okay.
And I think the other thing that we've seen some companies that just got approval right before COVID. And, their launch meetings were scheduled in March and April. Some of those companies have pivoted and had to relaunch their strategies. So we saw that happen. I think the other thing that I think is a pulse that we're going to have to really watch for, companies that, are actively involved in phase 3 is this volume of COVID treatment and vaccines that the agency is really going to have to put, approvals and policies in place, in this next third and fourth quarter. And so, are some of these companies going to get regulatory holds, for that time period or delays? I think just the key is really understanding the successful companies are going to be able to stop, think, pivot, and move on and create a new strategy. And I think that's what's going to be critical for success during this.
Absolutely. It's the time of thinking out of the box.
Yep.
And speaking of those living room meetings, our next panel, which will be virtual, will be around private equity and the pandemic, how to effectively raise capital while you're stuck in your living room. We are going to have that in mid-August. We are working on the final date with a couple of the investors who are going to join our panel. But I would really like to thank everyone so much for joining me here. This was great, and being willing to do the experimental first Crush remote virtual panel. So thanks to Michael Castagna, Alex Santini, Nerissa Kreher, and Laura Randa. And a special thanks for Laura for pulling this team together, because it's been excellent to work with you guys.
Thank you.
Thanks, Laurie, for doing it. Great conversation.
And we are we're doing notes, and we'll do an article, and this is also recorded in case you want to share it. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, and have a great day and stay healthy.
You too.